A couple months ago, I released a general critique of Elden Ring where I detailed some problems that I had with the game. I think the most important takeaway from that video was how the overtuned and overly aggressive boss fights were often at odds with the quote-unquote hard but fair ideology that defined the Souls games Bloodborne and Sekiro. The more I've played Elden Ring, the more I've started to feel that its greatest flaw is that it tries too hard to surpass its predecessors, and these boss fights are the biggest symptom of that mindset. The best way I can describe them is over-engineered. So much bloat has been attached in what feels like an attempt to uphold the FromSoft reputation of being mind-numbingly difficult, which has ironically strayed them as far as they've ever gone from the series' original appeal. It pains me a little bit to say this, but Elden Ring has left me with a nagging sense that the series' combat is showing signs of stagnation. In this video, I'll be detailing all of my praises and all of my problems with the game's boss design by looking at the major fights on a case-by-case basis. The overall goal is to examine what makes boss fights succeed and fail in these games, and talk about what kind of lessons can be taken away from Elden Ring, because I worry that the game's monstrous success will propel future titles in a similar direction. There's just a couple housekeeping items to go over before jumping into it. First off, this game has over 100 bosses with lots of different ways you can classify them, so I've deliberated quite a bit over what constitutes a major boss. There is no clear one-size-fits-all criteria. Just doing remembrance bosses is a decent start, but that would exclude lots of important fights like Margit and Loretta. Conversely, talking about all 100-something bosses would be excessive, plus there's a lot of duplicate bosses which needs to be somehow considered. I would like to avoid getting bogged down in every single enemy with a boss health bar, so here's what we'll go with. If the boss gives you a remembrance when you kill it, it's included in this video. In addition to that, I've picked out a handful of extra ones that have some relatively large significance, whether it's through the story, gating progression to an area, or in their moveset complexity. Basically, I've tried to pick things that would actually be interesting to talk about. This is the final list that I've settled on. It probably isn't perfect, but for the purpose of studying the game's overall boss design philosophy, I think it's perfectly adequate. I should also mention that I've done all of these fights except for one of them without summons of any kind. While I'll always advocate that it's perfectly valid to use the tools that you have the most fun with, I really dislike the effect that summons have on the game, so I won't be using them. There's a chapter near the end of my Elden Ring critique that addresses this in further detail, but the gist of it is they turn the tides in your favor too drastically by breaking the aggro on many bosses. They're strong enough that they would render many talking points completely irrelevant, and it wouldn't make for a very interesting discussion if I brute forced every single fight with a Mimic tier. I'd also like to quickly mention that I've gone through Elden Ring 4 times with very different builds each time. First a Dex Arcane Bleed build, then a Strength Faith Melee Magic hybrid, then Pure Magic, then Pure Strength. The wealth of options that Elden Ring provides means that two people could have extremely different experiences against the same bosses, so I've done my best to cast a wide net and look at these fights with different approaches. That should be everything, so with all that said, thank you for joining me. Let's talk about Elden Ring's bosses, starting with Margit. Generally speaking, the more I've fought bosses throughout the Soulsborne series, the more things I've found to love about them. Unfortunately, the opposite has happened many times with Elden Ring, including Margit, who's fallen from one of my favorite bosses to being just decent. Before getting into his actual moveset though, I think it's important to acknowledge Margit's placement in the game. He's somewhat analogous to the Asylum Demon or Eudex Gundyr, the tutorial boss that you need to beat to prove that you have the aptitude for the game. The key difference is that Margit doesn't block progression. Technically he's an optional boss, it's just very unlikely that new players will skip him given that he's situated fairly early on in Limgrave. Difficulty is difficult to quantify, but I think it's fair to say that Margit is a considerable step up from many early bosses that the series has seen before now. Making an early boss such a massive roadblock would be counterproductive in many games simply because it's an easy way to turn away new players, but it works greatly in Elden Ring's favor. It's a teaching moment that takes nice advantage of the new open world format. There's hours of content that you can tackle before Margit, and if you do that first, you'll come back to him with better levels and gear. He'll be a lot more reasonable that way. I think he communicates this intention very well, and while FromSoft has never really shied away from bold choices like this one, they still deserve some amount of praise for recognizing that it was the right thing to do. There's more to Margit than just the fight itself. It's a clever way to demonstrate that you aren't really required to do anything in any particular order. It's encouraging you to interact with other components of the game. Regarding his actual mechanics, he's a decently strong start, but he marks the beginning of many problematic trends that are found across bosses for the rest of the game. For example, he has an abundance of delayed attacks with very long windups leading into an instant spring of a hitbox, moves that you can only dodge by learning their strict timing instead of reacting naturally to an incoming attack. Now, these sorts of things are more forgivable with Margit since he comes so early in the game when you're still being taught all of the lessons. Delayed attacks have a lot of advantages, like punishing panic rolling and diverting from purely reactive play, which are good lessons to reinforce with the first boss. It makes sense that Margit is here to foster that mindset early, but the game relies on delayed attacks far too much to uphold its difficulty, which will be a very consistent complaint throughout this video. Something else about Margit that I've only realized after fighting him so much is that positioning is often just as important for avoiding his attacks as rolling. Sticking close to him for most of the fight isn't really safe, since some of his moves attack faster than you can roll, and you need to make sure you're a safe enough distance to dodge away from them should they come out. His 3-hit combo is a good example of this. I've never been able to roll through it without getting hit at least once. The timing is either extremely tight or downright impossible. The second or third hit always catches the tail end of your roll animation before you can act again. This would be fine if the telegraph gave you enough time to position yourself properly before his hitbox came out, but the first sword swing of this combo comes out so quickly that unless you're already a safe distance away, there's not much you can do. It's one of many moves in the game that doesn't give you adequate time to adjust your positioning, especially considering that he can do it just after you've punished one of his moves. This isn't helped by the fact that lots of his recovery windows aren't very clear. At the end of many combos he makes it look like he's done attacking, but as soon as you get close he'll pull out his knife and start another chain. It's a bit deceptive, which I don't really mind in theory, but it narrows your opportunities to engage with him and funnels players into being a lot more defensive. I never started picking up on this behavior until I got more comfortable with the fight, since it felt like my options for approaching him never changed with my skill level. You still have to engage with him the same way you did on your first few attempts, by playing very passively and only waiting for the handful of openings that you know are safe. All of your decisions are the same. You can just traverse through the flowchart of options faster while making fewer mistakes, and such a noticeable skill cap makes him a lot less exciting to return to. His greatest weakness is probably the issue of his ambiguous recovery windows. Either the animation would need to better communicate when he is and isn't done attacking, or the constant knife sidearm moves need to be toned down. It's very obnoxious having a boss only follow up as soon as you get close, because it feels like you're being disallowed from playing. The only reason I don't think Margit is downright bad is because these problems have a comparatively smaller magnitude. Most of his moveset feels pretty good otherwise, with a difficulty that's well adjusted for his place in the game. The highest compliment that I can give Margit is that he leaves a very strong first impression. It's just that those feelings have dwindled a lot over time. It is equally upsetting that even though he's just decent overall, he still remains one of the better bosses when put against Elden Ring's remaining lineup.
I shall remember thee, tarnished.
Godrick fares considerably better than Margit, and he's one of my favorite fights. The boss quality reaches a pretty high peak this early on with Godrick, and takes a very shaky trajectory after him. Honestly, I don't think it reflects very well on Elden Ring that two of the better bosses are strategically placed right at the beginning, as if to hide the troubles that the rest of the game faces, but that's kind of a separate discussion. Anyway, one thing they definitely got right with Godrick from a thematic standpoint is portraying him as one of the more pitiful demigods. Despite how intimidating he might look initially, many other characters don't speak very highly of him, not necessarily because he's weak, but rather he's pathetic. He tries to replicate the power of other demigods artificially by grafting all his body parts together, and beneath all of those limbs is a character deservedly stuck in the shadow of his lineage. I don't normally comment on lore details, but I think many people's perception of Godrick has changed a lot over time, and it makes for a pretty interesting character, so I thought it was worth mentioning. The main reason that he's one of the strongest bosses in the game is because, unlike many others, there's not tons of bloat weighing him down. He has a nice combination of melee attacks, AoEs, mobility tricks, and so on. There's no absurdly long combos, no unexpected gimmicks, and his downtime between attacks is very reasonable. They knew when enough was enough with Godrick, and the moves that he does have were given the care and balance that they needed, for the most part. Once again though, he relies on delayed attacks a bit too much for my liking, particularly with one of his basic axe swings. The common problem with these moves is that they'll be delayed to a degree where it just looks unnatural. The reality with many games is that our brains have a tendency to apply real-life logic to whatever's happening on screen, which is partially what determines our following actions. When you see an enemy raise their weapon, your natural response in both real life and in Elden Ring is to do something as soon as it's at the apex. Games that manage to tap into those instincts and let us operate purely on intuition without having to worry about the game's rules tend to feel the most natural to play. Lots of people would describe this as immersive, or entering into that precious flow state. Delayed attacks will force the player to go against those impulses, which isn't automatically a bad thing. In fact, it can create a lot of value if it's used properly. For the purposes of creating a difficult game, I'd say it's almost necessary at certain points, since, like I mentioned with Margit, it can punish bad habits and generate different responses from the player. But when this trick is used as excessively as it is in Elden Ring, you go too far with that idea and constantly punish the player for acting on instinct. Whenever one of these delayed attacks comes up, you have to remind yourself that the boss isn't behaving how a normal entity would, and the flow state is at least somewhat broken as a result. The axe swing that I mentioned earlier is Godrick's best example of this, but his mini earthquake, his jump attack, and his more powerful wide arc swing also do it to varying degrees. The only one that I'd say ventures into overly frustrating territory is that axe swing, but these things can only remain tolerable for so long. You need only to look at his 5-hit combo for an example of something that feels much more natural. The swings come out when you'd expect, and it's fun to weave through them while still being difficult to fully avoid. He gains a few additional attacks in Phase 2, but otherwise the fight is pretty similar. I still greatly enjoy the second phase, partially because of the cutscene that initiates it, which is both incredibly cool and incredibly fitting for his whole pathetic demigod portrayal. I really like phase changes that come out of left field like this. Obviously it makes sense for Godrick's character to staple on stronger limbs like he does, but I wasn't anticipating getting to see that change directly. It's up there as one of my favorite phase transitions in the series. Another advantage of Godrick that shines throughout the fight is having very clear attack telegraphs. This is somewhat in contrast to Margit, who didn't always make it clear when his attacks were finished. Godrick is very much the opposite, and it makes for a much more enjoyable battle. Not only is there adequate time to identify his attacks as they're about to come out, it's also always clear when it's safe for you to retaliate. This is part of what makes him feel like a more natural fight. It never feels like you get unfairly punished for correctly identifying his behavior. The numerous dragon attacks he gains are a great example of this. His new arm sort of exhibits behavior of its own with moves like the grab, and all of it is very satisfying to read and dodge. Unfortunately, there is one element of Godrick that throws a pretty big wrench into all of this. It's a very major issue that I'm surprised hasn't been addressed in patches yet. His whirlwind attack has an extremely short startup and he can pull it out whenever he wants. To compare him to Margit again, it's kind of like the 3-hit combo that I was complaining about, only I think Godrick is worse. If you walk in to punish one of his moves, there's a chance he'll do the whirlwind before you have a chance to reposition safely. It also comes out too fast to reasonably react to, which just crosses the line into blatant unfairness. Attacks like these are part of why I don't think it's a reasonable defense to say that positioning is the solution to Elden Ring's boss problems, because you aren't even left with enough time to do that. I think you would be justified in saying that this move alone is enough to bring Godrick standing down, even though almost everything else about him is great. If it did more damage, I would probably feel that way too. It's a really bad move that would benefit greatly from a slower startup. If you did that, plus made a couple of his attacks less delayed, Godrick would pretty easily be my favorite boss, and up there as one of the stronger fights in the whole series. As it stands now, he's one of the best in Elden Ring, which, while great, is generally at a lower standard than its peers. Either way, I do really like Godrick. It's just a big disappointment that things don't get a whole lot better from here.
Hush, little Culver.
Rennala has a whole lot of style, but with very little substance. Her two phases try to combine a gimmick boss and a normal boss into a single fight, but I think it would have gone over much better if they committed to one of those styles because the two phases sort of clash with each other in their current state. Phase 1 is the gimmick fight. It's a puzzle where she's invulnerable until you break her shield by attacking certain enemies in the arena. It's not difficult, and there's very few attacks coming at you, but I think that's fine. The atmosphere makes it worthwhile. The music lends quite a bit to the scene, and I think the Grand Library environment fits very well with Raya Lucaria's Magic Academy theme. The entire dungeon is more occult than Stormveil, and the boss has a mysterious tone to match that. I also think using sound to identify where the shielded enemies are is kind of cool. It took me a while to realize this, but the singing always originates from the enemy you're supposed to attack. Once you figure that out, it's a lot easier to blitz through Phase 1. The main problem with gimmicks like these is that they only have an emotional impact the first time you see them. If you die, any subsequent attempts lose their luster, since the experience had to be interrupted. I won't spoil what it is here, but Sekiro addressed this issue with one of its gimmick fights by making it so easy and simple to understand that you can win on your first try, even without any prior knowledge of the boss. It dropped the pretense of being anything other than a spectacle fight, and it's very successful as a result. This is where Phase 2 of Rennala comes in. It still isn't hard, but it is an actual fight where you're more likely to die a couple times learning how everything works. If that happens, the Phase 1 gimmick becomes a chore that you have to put up with every time you want to re-attempt the actual fight. The first attack is another delayed move with heavy damage and unusual timing, and that alone can catch players off guard right away. I would have preferred to see the second phase given the complete spotlight. It's pretty easy once you realize you can just stick close and wail on her, while only needing to sprint around every now and then to dodge most of her magic. The way you respond to everything isn't very involved, since you can get away with just running in circles. She's also faced with the issue of most of her attacks being ranged, which means her AI has to move far away from you to stand a chance. Since avoiding her attacks is pretty monotonous, there can be quite a bit of empty time where no side is making progress towards victory. It's kind of like Elden Beast's behavior, just on a smaller scale. This is really just my long-winded way to say Phase 2 is boring, even though the arena remains visually strong. I also dislike how easy it is to get stun-locked against some of her attacks. If you get clipped by a single piece of magic, it can very quickly snowball into a bunch of stacked shots that deal a massive chunk of health if they don't kill you entirely. If something like this happens on your first couple encounters with Phase 2, they don't feel like fair deaths. It can become an overly harsh punishment for what was probably a pretty minor mistake on your part. Stun locks aren't exclusive to her at all, but she was the first instance where it got under my skin. Her most notable ability is the summoning of other enemies during the fight, which is yet another disappointment. I'm not sure if it had the effect that they were going for. They don't stick around very long, and it's easy to ignore them while continuing to focus on Rennala. Trying to kill them is more effort than it's worth, because you still have to deal with her magic attacks on top of that enemy's normal moveset. It's not like she's summoning unique enemies that are built to work in tandem with her magic. They're just the same wolves or knights found all over the world that have little bearing on how you fight the boss. The one final dig I want to take at her is that she's tied for the worst run back in the game. Now that we have Stakes of Marika, it's very odd to me that this is still a problem, especially in a boss fight that's already very tedious. If you use the shortcut and send the elevator back down each time, it takes about 1 minute to run to her from the nearest grace. That may not sound like much initially, but it adds up when combined with repeating the same Phase 1 puzzle every attempt on top of it. I know the lore justification for this is because Rennala probably hates Marika, so why would she want her stakes in the Academy, but I disagree heavily with letting such a mild story detail make gameplay more cumbersome. It's one of those things that feels more like a coincidence that we only notice after the fact. If there was one hypothetically sitting outside of her arena, would anyone actually question it? I'd argue no. I wonder how much the existence of Phase 1's gimmick hurts Phase 2's mechanics, and vice versa. I wish more focus could have been put on making her actual fight more interesting, but I would also accept the entire fight being a gimmick if they could have found ways to make a cooler puzzle. The focus on Rennala's fight was spread too thin, so neither phase really got the attention they deserved. The thematic elements are definitely the saving grace on this one. I'm just glad it isn't too difficult so the player isn't stuck repeating phase 1 for too long.
Weave thy night into being.
The Magma Wyrms arguably aren't prestigious enough to be on this list, but I wanted to include them solely for one reason. Their repeated fights do a good job at demonstrating the importance of the arena. The Magma Wyrms have lots of long-lasting AoEs that can restrict your mobility depending on where they're placed, and sometimes these AoEs can be spread by a charge move where the Magma Wyrm runs a pretty good distance across the arena. Basically, their attacks can cover a lot of ground, so the wiggle room that the player has to respond factors in a lot when determining the quality of these fights. Magma Wyrm Makar is the first variant of these that I fought, and it takes place in a nice open arena where all of its attacks get a chance to shine. The AI can get confused and run into walls every now and then, but even so, this is the best instance of the Magma Wyrms since there's nothing to distract from the fight itself. The lava pools that it can spawn are a more unique addition to its moveset, as a dynamic way of introducing obstacles on the field. If we look at the Magma Wyrm in Mount Gelmir, things will change. This one takes place right beside a large pool of lava, and the shape of the arena is much different. It's more like a narrow strip along this pool instead of a wide open space. As you might expect, this makes the fight a whole lot more frustrating, even though the enemy itself is more or less identical. You have much less maneuverability in the Gelmir version, since a boss that already takes up a lot of space is thrown into a more restrictive environment. This can create incredibly long stretches without any opportunities to touch the Magma Wyrm because the AI can decide to use the running attack 3 or 4 times in a row, which covers the entire place in lava and strips away possible angles that you could approach at. The Magma Wyrm enemy itself is quite good when you have the space to deal with it. Once again, it has quite a few delayed attacks, but there's also a lot of movement going on as you run away from its fireballs or position yourself in the safest spot to attack it. That strength is just stunted by only one of them having an arena that takes full advantage of the Wyrm's potential. It goes to show how multifaceted constructing a boss can be. I appreciate wanting to add environmental hazards in certain fights, but the Magma Wyrms aren't a good execution of that idea. It takes a good boss and places it in a bad context, which definitely hurts its overall standing. If I were just discussing Magma Wyrm Makar, I'd say it's a very solid fight, but when looking across all of the Magma Wyrms, it gets a whole lot worse. For that, it averages out to being a very lukewarm boss overall.
Before we begin, allow me to paint you the full picture.
Radahn has a much more elaborate build-up out of all the bosses in the game. The Radahn Festival is referenced by several NPCs, and he's often heralded as one of the most powerful demigods in the lore. I think the fight itself mostly satisfies the expectations set by all of this, but it's a bit tricky to judge. Radahn has received several changes since the game's launch, and I'm not sure how that should factor in when appraising him. One thing that's held firm throughout the patches is his fantastic presentation. There's a scope to the Radahn battle that isn't really captured by any other fight. The arena is so vast that it takes up a massive portion of Caelid's map, and Radahn embodies the spirit of an insane, battle-hardened general very well. He's relentless and brutal in a way that commands your respect, and I can't think of a better way for him to go down than in the blaze of glory offered by the Radahn Festival. I think I recall the main problem plaguing him upon release were his hitboxes. They were way too large and inconsistent, and his damage was incredibly high to boot. If the fight was still in that state, it would be pretty terrible, but fortunately, I think the changes they've made have been for the better, even though he still isn't perfect. Perhaps his most defining trait is the heaps of NPC summons sprinkled throughout the arena. It lends a lot more to the theme of the fight rather than the mechanics. They aren't required to win, and honestly I find it harder with so many summons since you never know who Radahn is aggroed on that way. They felt more important pre-nerf when you needed tons of health sponges to stand a chance, but nowadays it's more of an optional bonus for those that want to go all in on the festival idea. I honestly don't have much to say about it. It's a fun way to fight him, but I still prefer riding solo. The other unique thing about Radahn is that this is one of the few major bosses where you can use Torrent, which I'm not sure how to feel about. Many of Radahn's attacks do seem to take Torrent into consideration, which is both a problem and a solution to the terribly primitive horse combat. For the most part, I hate fighting on Torrent. There's barely, if any, iframes, it's so much easier to get stun-locked, and attacking is a whole lot slower with timings that are just really weird to learn. It's extremely unwieldy, and relegates Torrent to being mostly a traversal mechanic. Radahn accounts for this by making many of his moves avoidable by just running around on your horse, which was a wise choice if they wanted to make Torrent a viable option, but it also does make things a little bit more boring. You aren't able to make quick adjustments on horseback since there's no equivalent to rolling, so the best way to dodge is just by staying on the move. You can rely on hit and run tactics pretty safely this way, and it isn't as engaging as battling on foot. I've ultimately enjoyed the fight the most by switching between the two. I try to stay up close early on when his melee combos are easier to dodge around, but as soon as it gets too hard to see what he's doing, or when I need a get out of jail free card, I'll switch to Torrent. It's not a terrible approach, and in tandem with the hitbox nerfs it makes Radahn pretty fun, but given how many different ways there are to fight him, I think whatever their intention was is communicated rather poorly. If you're meant to use all of the summons and steamroll him, then that's fine, but it would make for a pretty anticlimactic finish to the supposed mightiest demigod in the world. Alternatively, Torrent's awkward controls makes that option very unappealing, but also necessary if you want a reliable way to avoid some moves, so I'm not sure. Somewhat similar to Rennala, there are some conflicting priorities here. Honestly, I think more of my problems lie with Torrent than with Radahn. If Torrent wasn't as clunky as he is, Radahn could have been turned into the game's signature horse battle. He's designed with Torrent's limitations in mind, and I appreciate that, but they are just that, limitations. Even if part of the fight works around them, it's hard to avoid heaps of problems that crop up with horse combat. To be a little bit more positive, Radahn does have a more well-balanced moveset in terms of damage, timings, and recovery windows. Fighting him on foot is still a viable approach, at least against some moves, and he's at his peak during those moments. Even though many of his melee attacks just flail around everywhere, they are possible to dodge through with enough time to follow up afterwards. I shouldn't have to praise bosses for this, but there's also no cheap surprises for when you get up close, nothing blatantly unavoidable like Godrick's Whirlwind to deter you from being aggressive. Once you can find the confidence, clashing with Radahn does make him feel worthy of that legendary status, and for a fight of such grand proportions, it's very satisfying to feel like the two of you can stand on even ground. Radahn's problems being addressed in patches goes to show how Elden Ring's bosses are very fixable. It's just frustrating that, as of the making of this video, others haven't gotten the same treatment that he has. I suppose it was important to FromSoft that they got this fight right, since Radahn will probably last in the memory of Elden Ring players for a while. For better or for worse, he embodies the scale and identity of the game better than most other bosses, so even though there are several slip-ups on the execution, it's difficult to ignore how memorable he is. Once the beautiful music and atmosphere wears off, the Regal Ancestor spirit is pretty bad. In fact, because it's a more atmospheric fight, it suffers very heavily from being recycled. Almost everything about this boss is identical to the regular Ancestor spirit found in Siofra, so it leaves a much weaker impression this time around. I don't want to undersell just how good the visuals are, but we're only 6 bosses in, and I've lauded both Rennala and Radahn for the same thing. I would be more okay with these aesthetic-focused bosses if the traditional fights were up to par. I don't mean to suggest that every boss needs intensive mechanical complexity on the level of Godrick or Radagon, because having some simpler bosses like this one can serve as a refreshing break from those, but it's harder to justify their inclusion when the rest of the bosses are suffering. Much like Rennala, there's a lot of empty time where you're just running around to close distance. The thing can teleport across the arena, which just feels like the fight is being unnecessarily padded. Its actual attacks aren't bad in terms of variety and fairness, but it's very slow-paced in a way that causes lots of impatience. On top of that, the Regal Ancestor Spirit can heal a bunch of health with, as far as I can tell, no way to prevent it. It absorbs the souls of the rest of the animals in the arena, and the only way to counteract it is just piling on damage. I suppose that calling it a DPS check would be a reasonable justification, but that doesn't do anything to change the boring factor. The magic breath attacks are especially annoying since all you have to do is back off and wait for them to finish. It's not like it sticks out for being exceedingly terrible, but it doesn't do anything particularly well either. If the regular Ancestor Spirit didn't exist, I'd probably feel differently, but that fight comes first and does everything that this fight does. In fact, it's more memorable since that's the first time you get to experience the atmosphere. I won't rehash all of my complaints about the generous boss reuse in Elden Ring, but this definitely demonstrates why it can be a problem. The Ancestor Spirit isn't interesting to fight, and just getting to experience it once would have been plenty. Unfortunately, I don't really know what else to say about it. The boss is very basic and one of the more forgettable Remembrance bosses. They would do well to prolong the fight a lot less. Perhaps letting the player kill some of the animal spirits to stunt the healing would be a viable option. I'm not sure if there's a limit on how often it can heal, but it definitely needs one. I've had fights where I had to go through at least 3 full health bars to take it down, and its moveset isn't nearly interesting enough to warrant it taking that long. All in all, the fight doesn't really bring anything to the table, and I would have much rather seen a unique boss occupy Nokron rather than fighting this thing again. It gets a very disappointed thumbs down from me. Gank fights have always been extremely hit or miss throughout the series, and Elden Ring is no exception. The Valiant Gargoyles are a pretty big miss, and the only reason I didn't used to hate them as much as I do now was because I usually and unknowingly came to the fight over-leveled. They're available as soon as you have access to Nokron, but the deep-root depths that they guard always felt like a more late-game area to me, so I would hold off until further in the game. By that point I usually had enough DPS to kill the first gargoyle before the second one even showed up, and the fight was nothing special. Now that I have experience fighting them at what seems like a more reasonable level, I really don't like them. The trap with gank fights that this boss falls into is that it pits you against 2 enemies whose movesets don't complement each other. These gargoyles, and the Blackblade kindreds that they're based on, feel like they were designed with one-on-one fights in mind since their melee attacks don't sync up well when fought in a pair. It's also incredibly annoying to keep your attention on 2 of them at once. When they both decide to attack, there's basically no chance for you to do anything other than watch and dodge. Compare this to something like Ornstein and Smough, who are built with each other in mind. They'll often take turns attacking so that you can juggle each of their movesets throughout the fight. These gargoyles are pretty solid enemies when placed on their own, but they don't add any value to each other. As a result, the only good part of the fight is the time before the second gargoyle shows up. Individually, they exhibit the traits of a well-balanced enemy with fair telegraphs and dodgeable moves and all of that. There's still a few unnecessarily delayed attacks, but some of them do look more natural on the gargoyles to make it a bit more excusable. The only move I'm not a huge fan of during the initial phase is the giant AoE that the first one can do, since it's kind of like Godrick's Whirlwind. If you aren't a safe enough distance away when he starts it up, you're probably going to get hit. As soon as the Twin Blade one shows up, everything goes downhill. There's one single attack that these guys have that makes initiating on your own way too risky. At any point in the fight, they can start spitting out a poison mist, which covers a good portion of the ground and deals tick damage while applying poison buildup. This single move is all it takes for the fight's quality to plummet. The first problem with it is that it has a terrible audio cue and visual indicator for where the poison is. You need to keep both gargoyles on screen at all times because otherwise there's no way to know when it's coming out. The noise they make when doing it is ridiculously quiet, and the actual poison is difficult to make out, and you won't notice it hitting you until your health is already being chunked. For starters, it needs a much more obvious audio tell, and the poison needs to be way more distinct on the ground. This move can also cause you to take damage through no fault of your own. If you're in the middle of an engagement with one gargoyle and the other starts spitting poison out, it's very likely that the poison will reach you before you can run to safety, even if the second gargoyle is really far away. This is part of what I mean when I say these enemies aren't meant to be fought together. One's poison mist can completely interrupt your fight with the other, like they want to constantly reset your tempo and drag things out as long as possible. With all of this in mind, the best way to fight them is to turtle and wait until their attacks line up in a way that you can sneak in a single hit. Play very passively until the stars align and you can take down one. As soon as it's back to a 1v1, things are better, but that doesn't excuse the nonsense that goes on when both are alive. It's extremely tedious and you have to be really careful about when you choose to engage, because the poison will absolutely rip through your health if you get caught in a bad spot. The second gargoyle alone is already too excessive, but throwing in one of the worst moves in the game on top of that makes the fight a complete train wreck. I'm not sure what the rationale was behind both of these decisions. It's not like adding in a second gargoyle makes the fight unique, it's just piling on more and more boss reuse which the game already has too much of. The poison mist is so blatantly ridiculous that I'm guessing it's one of those things that they didn't have enough time to properly adjust in playtest. They're usually pretty good about telegraphs on ranged attacks like this, and I would like to have enough faith in FromSoft that they just didn't have the resources to fix this, rather than it being an intentional design decision. With this game though, who knows? I don't think there's any gank fight in Elden Ring composed of completely unique enemies. It feels like whenever there's a 2-on-1, it's with guys that aren't originally meant to be fought 2-on-1. If they didn't have time to make two completely unique assets to fight alongside each other, then that's understandable, but at that point you should be questioning whether gank fights are a good idea to have in the first place. Tossing in the same enemy twice just screams unoriginality, and you wouldn't be wrong to argue that the game's scope proved too much for them to handle. It's not a good fight, lots of it is unnecessary, and it's yet another one that I've grown to hate the more I've played. Astel is pretty weird, both in terms of quality and of his context in the world. As the finale to Ranni's quest, I think he's very fitting. His design doesn't really seem like it belongs in Elden Ring, but that ends up working in his favor. It often feels like there's larger things at play when going through Ranni's quest, and putting such a peculiar-looking fight at the end lends very well to that mysterious feeling. The sequence of events you go through to reach Astel is also worthy of a finisher like this, so in terms of looks and theme, it'd be one of the strongest in the game. At least that's what I would say if Astel weren't casually recycled near the end in the consecrated snowfield. It really tarnished his unique image, and the Stars of Darkness version is so much more anticlimactic. He was such a special entity to fill in a special quest, but the fact that he can live in any old cave makes his presence a lot less impressive. I digress though, that doesn't speak much to the mechanics of the fight, so let's talk about that. Astel reminds me a bit of the amygdala from Bloodborne, in that you have to stick under his body and between his limbs to avoid lots of attacks. It's a bit of an unconventional method that's made possible thanks to the lanky construction of his body, and it does lead to some more interesting responses to his attacks. It can be trickier to damage him this way since his hurt boxes are pretty narrow, but I never found it frustrating or unfair. Elden Ring is actually pretty good about having accurate hitboxes and hurt boxes across the board, even with a twiggy body like Astel's. It's easier to focus on his head whenever possible anyway. The one exception to this is his grab hitbox. Now, I don't have any personal experience with this, so I can't show any examples, but I've seen many clips floating around of his grab being able to catch you when you aren't near where the actual hands meet. It always looked like that it extends too far up his arms. I'm not sure if this has been fixed in patches or not, but if it hasn't, I'd consider it a more notable flaw with him. These games have always struggled with grabs like this, so I guess it's not that outlandish to see it happen in Elden Ring. That aside, the main disadvantage that larger entities usually have is that you can't see what they're doing when you're so up close, and that does happen with Astel too, but I'm honestly not sure how much that should be held against him. FromSoft has demonstrated before that they can make massive enemies work nicely with the camera, and it's always a luxury to see that happen, but the fact that they don't implement these solutions regularly means that there must be some rationale behind making you fight oversized enemies like this. One potential draw that I can think of is that it makes you rely on sound cues, which is a completely different skill than reading the boss visually. If the move is happening off-screen but has a unique sound effect, you can ideally identify it that way and do your dodge timing accordingly. Astel doesn't fully realize this potential since many sound effects on his attacks are the same, but it can still be helpful against some moves. For example, whenever he teleports, he can either move to another part of the arena or he can appear on top of you and go for a grab. It's not always easy to spot where he's coming from before he appears, but if he's going for the grab, then the teleporting sound effect for when he reappears is less delayed. If you catch on to that quickly enough, you know to look above you instead of panning around the arena so that you can dodge the incoming grab. Mix-ups like that are a bit underutilized, not only in Elden Ring but across the whole series, so it's always an interesting way to create varied defensive options and depart from the usual roll out of the way method. It's also hard to deny that large entities like this one would lose a lot of their visual appeal if they were shrunk down to fit into frame, and by this point it's pretty clear that FromSoft wants to preserve that aspect with these bosses even if it doesn't always play nice with the camera. There are just two moves with Astel that I don't really like. The first is the aforementioned teleport that makes you run to the other side of the arena. It's similar to the issue with the Regal Ancestor spirits in that it creates a lot of empty time, though at least Astel does have some ranged magic that you have to dodge while closing the distance. I'm still not a fan of moves like these, since the game isn't really suited for running long distances without Torrent. The other is when he summons a bunch of meteors that rain from the sky for a few seconds. With things like this, I've never felt that there's any patterns or timings you can learn. The best way to stay safe is to roll or run away from them and just hope that you don't get hit. It's in the same courtyard as Rykard's Skull Raining attack or even Elden Beast's Elden Stars. Among these moves, Astel's is probably the least annoying, but it still doesn't elicit a very interesting response. Overall, I'm not sure what to make of Astel. It's a lot fairer with less of the bloated design that weighs down other bosses, but it's also the most ruined by being recycled later in the game, and it's so hard to just ignore that. I think it would be fair to say that Astel, along with the Regal Ancestor, are great examples of why reuse can really hurt the image of a fight, and why it's excessive in Elden Ring. At least they got more right with his moveset, because on that front, he's pretty good. At first glance, there's a lot to like about Lichdragon Fortissax. It's a nice break from the overabundance of field dragons found throughout the world, and the secrecy of his fight gives it a little bit more prestige. He's somewhat similar to Astel in that he lies at the end of an optional questline, though I feel like Fia's quest is easier to miss than Ranni's. I did my first playthrough completely blind, and Fortissax is one of 3 bosses on this list that I missed completely, the other 2 being the Gargoyles and Dragonlord Placidusax. I'm curious to know how many people missed major bosses like this one actually. Given how expansive Elden Ring is, I imagine it's fairly common to have missed at least one boss by playing blind, but it also probably depends on how thorough of a player you are. I would be interested to hear your experiences with this. Anyway, I want to like Fortissax more than I do, but there's a couple pretty big issues holding it back. First off, the overwhelming visuals that accompany Fortissax's fight are both a blessing and a curse. They serve the aesthetic much more than they serve the mechanics, because if there's one fatal flaw to Fortissax, it's that it's too visually busy. The special effects flashing everywhere, like the red lightning or occasional deathblight pools, can be highly distracting and make it hard to tell what you're actually being hit with. While the lightning has very good contrast, everything else, including the boss itself, blends in too much with the arena's dark color palette, which doesn't always make for a great experience. When it's difficult to make out everything in the arena like this, some amount of time has to be spent discerning what's actually happening before evaluating your response to it, and while such an approach can work, it's omnipresent in Fortissax's fight, which I'm not a huge fan of. I think it's just too excessive, and there are plenty of bosses that prove you can make fights visually interesting without having to distract the player as much. Fortissax still has some fantastic animations with his attacks, particularly the signature lightning lance spins, so even if the special effects were toned down, the boss's spectacle could still remain intact. The main culprit to me is all of the red lightning flickering over his body. When you're up close trying to do melee attacks, it can make it a bit harder identifying where his actual hitboxes are coming out during his attacks. There's also a quirk with Fortissax that acts as something of a melee deterrent. External lightning will target you and strike periodically for as long as you're underneath his body. It's kind of like a timer that's constantly ticking, and every time it reaches 0, you have to be ready to dodge. This is a pretty interesting idea in principle, but it's difficult to tune properly since, ideally, you want the lightning to land only at moments where the player isn't in the middle of dodging a regular move from the boss. Since every move has different timing though, there's no guarantee that this will happen. It's another case of potentially locking you into a risky situation even though you didn't make any direct mistakes yourself. The best way I found to circumvent it is to just stay on the move, which to be fair might be the intention. The tracking stops briefly before the strike actually hits, and I'm pretty sure that that delay is long enough for you to just walk out of the way. This is definitely better than forcing you to roll, but then the problem that crops up is that it can prevent you from attacking at otherwise opportune times. As soon as Fortissax is done attacking, you need to check that lightning timer to make sure that it's safe to lock yourself in an attack animation. If the timing doesn't match up, there's not much you can do about it. As you may have noticed, punishing aggression in some capacity is a very regular thing across bosses, and it's one of the more general trends that I really dislike. I talked about this a little bit with Margit, but Fortissax is a good example to elaborate with. Finding ways to initiate yourself is a great means of skill expression that the series has always utilized well, but many boss behavior in Elden Ring completely abandons that possibility. No matter how good you get at the fight, Morgott will still pull his knife out when you try punishing some attacks. The gargoyles will always spit poison that you have to run away from. Fortissax's lightning always has a chance to disrupt your attack opportunities. These are roadblocks that you just have to accept as limitations on what you can do against the boss, rather than obstacles that can be countered with some improvements to your play. Not only does it reduce motivation to get better at Elden Ring, it also actively reduces your engagement with the boss. One would probably expect Elden Ring to have the most replayability out of all the Souls games, but things like this would suggest the opposite. Fighting bosses feels the same every time, because there's not much you can do to give yourself an advantage. Because of his lightning tracking, Fortissax is one of few bosses who I found more fun when using magic instead of melee. Different bosses being made easier with different builds is a strength of the game as far as I see it, but it goes overboard when one build feels blatantly discouraged over another. It leaves me feeling very lukewarm to Fortissax overall. I would take him over the field dragons any day, but he still has some things to improve on. I'm not the biggest fan of Rykard, but I do view him more favorably than I used to. On one hand, he's arguably the best presented fight in the game, with such an epic scale that makes it the most memorable gimmick boss in the whole series. On the other hand, because it tries to behave somewhat like a regular encounter, it exhibits many of the same problems that the rest of the bosses do. First off, I really like that nothing in the fight is scripted. Even though it places a heavy emphasis on visuals and theme, it is a full sequence of gameplay that you have agency over. There's no mid-fight cutscenes where you just watch your character kill Rykard, no quick-time-like events, you're just given a cool weapon and a cool boss to use it on. I would also like to point out that Rykard only appearing once is a huge relief. If the Serpent Hunter gimmick appeared elsewhere, it would lose lots of its dramatic effect, for lack of a better word. But thankfully, the game never spoils Rykard's identity like that. The spear is satisfying to use, the effect looks awesome, it's perfectly suited for this fight, I really have no complaints there. It feels like Yorm's potential from Dark Souls 3 has been fully realized with Rykard. When we delve into his moveset though, I'm less enthusiastic. I have a feeling that Rykard is one of the more polarizing bosses in terms of difficulty, one that has a very wide spectrum of people that found him incredibly easy on one end, and people that could never click with it on the other. I fall more towards that latter side. He's always really frustrated me since I've never been able to find a consistent strategy. There's a few frustrating subtleties that crop up throughout the fight. For instance, while the arena is very spacious to make room for everything that's going on, I never know where I'm supposed to stand in relation to the boss. The Serpent Hunter has pretty solid range on most attacks, but I still often find many of them falling just barely out of reach. I also don't feel very safe standing closer, since its animations are actually pretty long, and Rykard can attack with the frustrating frequency that many other bosses do. I'm well aware that this could be a skill issue, but it's annoyed me enough times that I think whatever the happy medium is too well hidden. Either that, or it moves around too much, since Rykard is always slowly inching towards you. That's not the worst thing about the fight though. He has two attacks that are just straight up indefensible. The first is during phase 1 where he has the earthquake-like move where a bunch of fire shoots up from the ground. It's a really large AoE right in your direction, and as far as I can tell is an instance of unavoidable damage. Running to the side, rolling in different directions, positioning at different distances, jumping, I've tried all of these things and nothing has worked. My guess is that they want you to run perpendicular to where it's coming from, but then it's like Godrick's Whirlwind, it doesn't give you enough time to do the intended response. The Raining Skulls in Phase 2 are significantly worse though. Once again, you can only avoid it through running away, but this time there's much less guarantee for your safety. Even when running away as much as possible, sometimes you can get unlucky and a skull will just block your path and you get hit. These two attacks are what weigh him down the most. The Skull Rain is the more puzzling one to me because even if you could consistently dodge it just by running, the time it takes for them to subside still puts a damper on the whole experience. It's one of those moves where it's hard to think of any redeeming qualities for it. Rykard can also freely attack you while the skulls are falling, so again, it's possible to get trapped in a risky situation. If he forces a roll at the wrong time, you're probably going to take a bunch of skulls to the face. On the bright side, most other attacks from him are pretty solid. Not to sound like a broken record, but a few of them are still too delayed for my liking, particularly the Bite Grab in Phase 1 and some of his sword sweeps in Phase 2. Once again, these look like pretty unnatural delays designed specifically to trip you up instead of testing any particular skills. It's a pretty big ask to overlook all of these problems, but if you can manage to, Rykard is pretty good. The most important takeaway is that he demonstrates how to properly combine a gimmick fight with a normal fight. He does so much better than Rennala does. You still need to apply typical strategies to beat him, like rolling to dodge and finding safe attack opportunities and all of that, but the weapon that you're provided with makes the experience a lot more special. It's a gimmick that doesn't completely warp how you play the game, and while it is still a gimmick at the end of the day, it's probably one of the best that they've ever done.
Willful traitors, all.
Morgott was once a contender for my favorite boss in the game. In hindsight, I think I was being a bit too generous and letting the story context carry most of the fight. Elden Ring's story peaks at this moment in my opinion, but defeating Morgott marks the beginning of the endgame, which is easily the worst part in terms of gameplay. Never mind that though, nearly every fight so far has had a strong theme and atmosphere, and I'm tempted to praise Morgott for the same thing, but we're far enough in the game now that I don't think the spectacle should continue being the best things about these fights. It's clear by this point that every fight on this list is presented well, and that the thing that's been lacking is a fantastic boss with nothing to complain about. Morgott still isn't that boss, but he is very interesting, and he's a good opportunity to elaborate more on something I generally hate about bosses across the board. Bosses in this game attack way too often, and when I say that FromSoft tried too hard to surpass their previous games, this is one of the better pieces of evidence. Going back to Dark Souls 1 for a little bit after playing Elden Ring has really opened my eyes to how ridiculously short the downtime is between most bosses' attacks. It often feels suffocating with how many combos they'll dish out in such a short period without giving you an equal chance to retaliate. Obviously, the games have sped up since Dark Souls 1, so it might not seem like a fair comparison, but the other games have always sped you up with the enemy. When it comes to Elden Ring, it feels like bosses have been sped up way more than you have. It's like playing a chess game where your opponent gets to make 3 moves every turn while you can still only make 1. I suspect that this, along with the myriad of delayed attacks, is what FromSoft had to resort to in order to keep the series difficult for veterans. They've had to put in absolutely overwhelming patterns for people who are used to dodging the comparatively simple stuff, but if you ask me, that really wasn't the way to go. The result is a game that's extremely defensive without any room to express yourself, even though there's more options than ever for building your character. They aren't included in this video, but Leonine Misbegotten, Godskin Noble, and Elemer of the Briar are all prime examples of enemies that attack way too frequently. What makes Morgott interesting is that he might be the only boss who manages to get away with all of this, because he has it all, the excessive combos, the delayed attacks, and the crazy mobility. The only reason that he not entirely, but kind of makes it work is because his numbers across the board are a lot lower. Each hit really doesn't do very much damage, either because they wanted it to be a fight about hit trading, or because it's made up for by how long and how often his attacks come out. It's probably a bit of both. For instance, his most ridiculous combo is one where he pulls out 3 different golden weapons. He swings his dagger around, then flails 2 swords in front of him, then spins around a bunch of times with a hammer before finishing with a final slam. I haven't been able to count an exact number, but I'm pretty sure this combo throws out at least 12 different hitboxes, and dodging through all of them has pretty strict timing, but you don't need to learn it, because you can just roll through it on a whim and stomach whatever hits manage to catch you. The same is true for his spin attacks, and even some of his more common combos. It's probably more worth your time to fight him this way, because odds are you'll be able to out-heal him as well. In addition to his low damage, he has relatively low health. I don't have footage of it anymore, but I distinctly remember my very first kill on him only taking about 2 minutes, and that includes the time it takes for him to change phases. To be clear, I don't think bringing down the numbers is the solution to other bosses that have equally aggressive behavior. In fact, it's mostly been the opposite. It hurts the enjoyment of Morgott on subsequent playthroughs because unless you go into the fight intentionally underleveled, you're probably going to steamroll him every time. He's still poorly balanced, just in the other direction. It gives you the advantage to make the fight less frustrating, but also too easy. Fortunately, there are still other redeeming qualities to help make Morgott fairly enjoyable. He has some distance closing moves that he can pull out whenever he's far away, which justifies his rather erratic mobility. For example, his somersault looking move will often put a lot of distance between you two, but his charging spear attack or the impaling thrust with his sword can rocket him in your direction after the fact, so there's less pointless waiting. Even if he doesn't attack, he can just walk back up to you sometimes to keep the action going. Fights like Rennala and the Regal Ancestor were lacking this, which is why they were a lot more boring. Morgott has the right tools in his kit to prevent the pacing of the fight from being interrupted. Additionally, I think Morgott shows how boss reuse can be done well. I talked about this in my Elden Ring critique, so I won't repeat everything I said there, but even though he is the same character as Margit, he's gotten a very good moveset upgrade to keep the fight from being a carbon copy. I still like that many of Margit's moves return so that you can test your old muscle memory, but these moves don't make up the majority of his kit. There's a lot of new stuff that very much feels in the spirit of Margit without replicating him too much. Unfortunately, the fact that you can find regular Margit out in Altus Plateau before this partially ruins the surprise of Morgott showing up here, but purely from a moveset perspective, it's a very sensible upgrade. I just really wish he had more health so that his fight had more time to shine. It's always over before it has a chance to begin. At any rate, Morgott is the only boss in the game who I can say manages to be at least a little bit fun in spite of his excessive attack patterns. It can turn it into a hit trading fight, which is at least unique even if it's not super fun. Many bosses in the late game have behavior that follows in Morgott's footsteps, just without the low damage numbers, and they'll be a hell of a lot worse than him because of it. I don't have a whole lot to say about Commander Niall, other than that his fight has a solution that I don't really like. He summons a pair of adds at the beginning of the fight, one of which is the dual sword Banished Knight, who's one of the worst enemies in the game. Their spin attack has insane tracking and their combos are really long. It's not just bosses that are overtuned, it's also regular enemies like these. They were wise to make some adjustments to numbers and AI for this fight, since I'm pretty sure his adds have less health than they do as normal enemies, and if you kite them around the arena, Niall will mostly leave you alone to deal with them. I still really don't like the fight though. These obnoxious enemies distract a lot from Niall himself, and he would have been just fine if it remained a 1v1. It goes back to the Valiant Gargoyles problem. These enemies don't complement each other, they were just an uninspired and failed attempt to make the fight more interesting. If you want to make the fight easier for yourself, you can use Bewitching Branches on the adds and turn them against the boss. It effectively makes them your own summons. This is probably the best way to fight him simply because it makes it less of a headache, but then it has the same problem that Spirit Ashes do. The fight becomes a joke since the AI isn't well suited for handling multiple targets. Plus, the Banished Knights are so busted that they can deal half of Niall's health without you having to do anything. There's no medium between laughably easy and ridiculously frustrating. Maybe the challenge is supposed to be realizing that Bewitching Branches are the solution, but if that's true, I would have liked to see some kind of hint or reminder that the item exists. With how many materials and consumables are in Elden Ring, it's easy to gloss over a lot of them, and Bewitching Branches fall into that category. I completely forgot they existed until I was reading about other people's experiences with the fight. It would also be easy to criticize the fight for encouraging the use of consumable items, but fortunately this isn't a major problem for Niall. There are enough Bewitching Branches available for purchase that you probably won't have to spend much time farming for them. I don't mind fights needing items as long as those items are easily replenishable, such as to eliminate grinding. As for Niall himself, he's just a very average enemy. His moveset is a little small, and I don't like how delayed his flying kick is, and none of the problems with him get solved by throwing in a couple extra enemies. My guess is that his limited moveset is supposed to be compensated by the adds, which just isn't a very creative way of expanding on a boss. In short, Commander Niall is very unimaginative. It's a simple boss that had to be inflated by making it a gank fight, with a solution that isn't particularly satisfying to use. Among the quote-unquote side bosses, the ones at the end of smaller overworld dungeons like Castle Sol, he's definitely one of the least exciting.
Welcome, honored guest, to the birthplace of our dynasty.
Mohg is the boss who I've probably had the biggest shift in opinion on since my last Elden Ring video, and fortunately it's been for the better. His fight is very well paced despite the presence of several delayed combos. The thing with Mohg is that pretty much all of his moves come out at least a little bit slower than you would expect, and the entire fight is defined by adapting to these unusual timings. It doesn't hurt Mohg the way it hurts other bosses because 1, these delays usually look sensible with his animations, and 2, the entire fight maintains a slower tempo. Delayed attacks can create an inconsistent flow in other fights because they're specifically meant to throw you off. They force you to make some very jarring adjustments to your rhythm by coming out in the midst of more naturally timed attacks. For instance, after weaving through Morgott's rapid dagger, sword, hammer flurry, he can suddenly shift to a 3-second wind-up stab. The transition between these moves doesn't feel very smooth. When you know that all of Mohg's moves have these mild delays on them, you don't go through those sort of frustrating adjustments. You just have to train yourself to do every dodge a half-second to a full second later than you're used to. Once you settle into that rhythm, you don't have to worry about being unexpectedly ripped out of it. Mohg respects that you've learned his timings, and just wants to put that to the test as much as possible. There are still a few things that you could criticize him for, with the most pressing one in my opinion being his transition to Phase 2. This is an instance of literal unavoidable damage. When going into Phase 2, Mohg will apply blood loss on you 3 times and there's nothing you can do to stop it. However, the damage can be heavily mitigated by drinking one of the wondrous physic tears that you acquire from doing Yura's questline. At a certain point, there's an NPC invader at a church in Altus who will drop it for you. Honestly, it's not so much the unavoidable damage part that's bothersome as it is the weirdly obscure item you're supposed to use. Mitigating the damage simply isn't very intuitive. Missing out on quest lines is pretty easy in this game, and if you didn't happen to progress Yura's far enough before this point, I'm not sure how you're expected to work out the solution. Nothing about Yura suggests a connection to Mohg, and I can imagine the frustration someone playing blind will experience when they come across this attack and just assume that you need to chug a bunch of health flasks to deal with it. I was lucky to have found the tier naturally on my first playthrough, but it's still not a very good gimmick. Another fair criticism would be that he exposes problems with the game's buffer system. This is not exclusive to Mohg, but I was waiting until now to talk about it because I find that he and Radagon are where it punishes you the most. Simply put, Elden Ring buffers your roll inputs for way too long. If you mistime your dodge by the tiniest amount, it will still often queue up your input and make you roll as soon as you're freed from hit stun, even though you only pressed the button once. This is one of my biggest complaints about the combat system, and it's frankly asinine to me that they thought the buffer being this large was okay. Many attacks are specifically timed to punish incorrect rolls, which means that failing one dodge will often lead you into getting punished twice. You'll get hit for pressing the button too late, which is fair, but then you'll roll right into another attack afterwards and take another hit that you didn't deserve. The buffer has existed in all the games before this, but it's never been this unnecessarily punishing. Buffer systems are very helpful when you have to execute highly complex inputs. That's why they're a core mechanic in fighting games, but Elden Ring is not at all like that. There's no reason for it to be as long as it is. It's a very noticeable issue with Mohg because his attacks look a lot slower, so when you watch your character dive straight into another attack after your mistake, it's like watching a car crash in slow motion. It'll look like there should have been plenty of time for the buffer to clear, but it still doesn't. Lastly, you could argue that the Bloodfire pools in Phase 2 are his indicator of bloated design. I previously criticized them for limiting your engagement opportunities too much and trapping you into unsafe dodges. I mostly take back what I said though. These moves emphasize positioning and careful play better than other similar attacks do. You want to stay relatively close to Mohg so that his Bloodfire flies over you. If you get cold feet and try to back off, that's when you'll get punished. The fire tends to accumulate behind you, so rolling away from him usually isn't safe. You need to stay confident and trust that it'll miss you. The truth is, Mohg's attacks are well balanced for that approach so that he rarely forces you into a risky position with these arena hazards. It seems like the AI knows which moves to chain together and which ones not to, so that you always have a safe option when dodging. Moreover, the Bloodfire pool durations are properly tuned to work with his moveset. They will disappear when you need them to disappear, and he doesn't attack so relentlessly that he'll cover all of your space. Even though it may not feel like it at first, you're always given the proper leeway that you need. It is true that sometimes he'll stand on top of it in a way that makes melee engagement impossible, and I don't really like those moments, but they make up a very small portion of the fight. The key is to not let impatience get the better of you. That's the trap that I fell into. Trying to find shortcuts to circumvent the fire just isn't an option. You have to play Mohg's game. Once that clicks with you, you'll hopefully find that Mohg's game is actually pretty fun.
I can see it as clear as day. The coming of our dynasty.
Elden Ring's endgame has been very frequently criticized for the enemies having way too much health and dealing way too much damage. Mountaintops of the Giants and the Consecrated Snowfield easily exhibit the most balance issues out of any area in the game, and for proof of that, you need look no further than the Fire Giant. This is yet another tedious fight that's prolonged by empty time where you often need to close distance and dodge attacks by just running around. That's about all Torrent is good for when it comes to combat, so it's nice that he's available, but that doesn't make fighting on horseback any more enjoyable. Lots of the Giants' wide-reaching attacks don't even feel dodgeable on Torrent. The lack of iframes really stings here. I've only been able to dodge some moves by mounting and dismounting at the right time, which isn't very intuitive or smooth. He's also easily the biggest boss in the game, so naturally the camera is going to cause problems. It's the most frustrating with him because his attacks will always be coming out off screen. The frame can barely fit in a single foot, but his attacks come out from his hands, his stomach, basically everywhere that you can't see. With Astel and Fortissax, you could at least notice their bodies shifting or use sound cues to get a feel for what's going on. The Fire Giant doesn't have anything to justify his gargantuan size other than the spectacle, which by now isn't a good enough reason. A colossal HP bar combined with very high damaging attacks doesn't do him any favors either. Chipping away at him gets extremely tiring, and that progress can very easily be ripped away if you make some small slip-ups and die in just 1 or 2 hits. Giving enemies so much health can be a good thing if the fight is meant to test your mental stamina. Even Mohg kind of did this, since he heals most of his health when transitioning to Phase 2, and it worked well in that fight because you don't get instantly chunked when you take a single hit. The Fire Giant, on the other hand, is extremely unforgiving since his attacks do so much damage, which is really counterproductive if the intention is to make the fight an endurance test. It's naturally more likely that the player will make mistakes the longer a fight lasts, because there's more time to mess up, and if the boss is to recognize this, I think it's much wiser to only kill you if lots of little mistakes build up over time instead of giving them a chance to kill you over a single blunder. The further you get into the fight, the more frustrating you'll feel if and when you mess up. Dying when he's at 10 or 20% HP is extremely discouraging since it takes so long to redo all of that progress. This boss needs a much better balance of letting the player make mistakes while still preserving the challenge of being a drawn-out fight. I think his worst attack is when he starts summoning large fireballs that track you for a really long time before exploding. The best way to avoid them is just to stay out of reach and drag them around until the explosion is out of the way. You always have to be very alert to these because they tend to explode off screen if you're not paying attention. The fire that lingers on the ground afterwards can stun lock you and leave you stuck underneath the giant's body if you aren't vigilant. It's another good example of a move that disrupts the fight's pacing. If you're trying to attack the giant when one of these fireballs comes out, you have to run away to safety before you can continue. I could sit here and nitpick the rest of his moveset because honestly, all of his attacks are problematic in some capacity, but it isn't worth the time. His numbers are the main issue. His size and moveset don't lend itself well to such a drawn-out fight. As the boss of the mountaintops, I guess he's fitting in a sort of twisted way. It's like the ultimate metaphor for everything wrong with Elden Ring's endgame. Bloated HP bars, terribly unforgiving damage, lots of empty time, and most important of all, he proved to be way too big for his own good. Even though she isn't super remarkable, Loretta is probably my favorite boss in the game. She's great for many of the same reasons as Godrick. She's a nicely refined encounter without any excessive mechanics tacked on to inflate her difficulty. My main complaint is less to do with her mechanics and more the fact that she's another recycled fight. There's lots of time between this and the Korea Manor version, so the frequency isn't as bad, but it is kind of an anticlimactic boss given the area. Putting that aside, the most refreshing thing about Loretta is that she has very few delayed attacks. Her moves look and behave a lot more naturally, which is an important reminder that relying on instinct for fights can still be very fun. It feels like FromSoft forgot that not every single boss needs their own gimmicky curveball to make them harder. Loretta does nothing of the sort. It's a very back-to-the-basics test, which ironically makes it stand out in the sea of overtuned fights. She also doesn't attack with the same ridiculous frequency that Morgott or Malekith do. Even with a heavy weapon, there's adequate time to punish her, and it's always pretty clear when those opportunities arise. Like many bosses, staying in melee range is a pretty safe bet. You can iframe through many of her spear attacks, and her patterns remain consistent throughout, so whenever she starts a combo, you know what to expect. You know that it's not going to lead into any unexpected surprises. Allowing for these openings makes Loretta a whole lot more fun to return to on subsequent playthroughs. There's a higher skill cap on her compared to things like Margit and Rykard. Once you get more comfortable with the fight, you'll become more keenly aware of openings that you hadn't noticed before. It might feel like Loretta attacks too much initially, but everything she does is consistent and telegraphed. At a certain point, her behavior becomes much more predictable, which you can exploit once you've gotten better at the fight. It's things like this that make improving at the game worthwhile, and it's disappointing that so few bosses give that opportunity. There's not many fights in Elden Ring that I look forward to returning to, but she is one of them. The only move of hers that really bothers me is her magic lance spin in Phase 2 since she hangs in the air for so long. It's the only exception to the delayed attack praise I was giving earlier. It just looks a bit silly and feels very at odds with the rest of her moveset. That aside, there's not a whole lot to complain about here. Loretta shows the power of simplicity. She doesn't feel the need to rise above and prove herself. They were content with making her a relatively standard Souls boss that ticks all the right boxes. It would be hard to argue that she's one of the greatest bosses to have ever graced the series because she doesn't have the sort of wow factor that the best of the best do, but within Elden Ring she sits in a very comfortable place.
I am Malenia, Blade of Miquella.
Malenia has garnered the most infamy in the Elden Ring community, and rightfully so in my opinion, so there's not much I can say about her that you haven't heard already. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that there's one boss that I haven't beaten without summons, and she is that boss. I cannot beat Malenia solo, and if that makes me bad at the game, then fine. I'm bad at the game. I've wasted too much time putting up with Waterfowl Dance to care anymore. I think the most tragic thing about her is that she's very, very close to being great. There's good ideas in this fight that are ruined by Elden Ring's habit of not knowing when to stop and say that enough is enough. For example, she's another overly aggressive enemy that can unleash ridiculously long combo strings before giving you a turn, but it's actually almost fun on Malenia because she can be quite vulnerable to hit stun, which is a very good idea when giving players an option to counter her behavior directly. Allowing the player to knock Malenia out of her combos can go a long way in fostering aggression, and it can actually happen sometimes during the fight. I've tried playing hyper-offensively against her before, and when that works in your favor, it's such a foreign feeling because you're finally being rewarded for taking the initiative. It takes me back to some of the best hunter fights in Bloodborne, where the pace never slowed down and you were always having meaningful interactions with the enemy. Unfortunately, this is not a consistently viable approach, and playing aggressive against her is just as risky as against any other boss, for 2 reasons. The first is that some of her moves have hyper armor, and there's a chance she can initiate one while you're in the middle of an engagement. So really, she can only be put into hit stun sometimes, and you can't reliably predict when those times are because her attacks come out so fast. If you're mid-attack animation when she gets hyper armor, there's not enough time to exit that animation and roll away afterwards. The second reason is because of Waterfowl Dance, because of course it is. When you get her HP into Waterfowl territory, staying near her for an extended period is no longer safe, whether that's in neutral or when you're trying to attack her. If you're trying to hit stun her when this move comes out, you are super screwed because dodging Waterfowl from up close is just miserable. You're risking way too much damage for it to be worth it. This is such a shame because otherwise she has all of the mechanisms to make relying on hitstun feasible. She can free herself by backing off to prevent that strategy from being too spammable, and she still uses several gap closers to prevent that from creating excessive dead time. Additionally, it would really help turn her into a fight that you have to master through confidence. I'll reference this game again because I think it's a great comparison. To those that have played a lot of Bloodborne, the evolution of fighting her could have felt like fighting Father Gascon. When you encounter him for the first time, you're more inclined to be defensive and avoid damage through dodging because he seems so relentless, but as time goes on, you'll realize that he can be stunned and comboed just as easily as you can. Instead of dodging his moves, you can just suppress them entirely, and the boss progresses from this passive engagement where you were too nervous to fight back into a bloodbath where you can become the dominant force and overpower him. It's a fight that inspires confidence. Malenia never passes that passive stage, even though she had the potential to. You always have to hesitate before trying to attack her because there's a chance she'll just armor through whatever you're doing, and I really do think that she could have been one of the game's best fights if her poise didn't work this way. The other mechanic worth talking about with her is the lifesteal. I think this would have been fine, if not a little gimmicky, because yet again it can encourage aggressive play. Players would be less inclined to try dodging through her moves if messing up meant giving her additional health. It goes back to that Gascon approach I was just talking about. It might be easier to just keep wailing on her to prevent those opportunities in the first place. That would require her hyper armor issues to be resolved first though. Instead of that, I suspect the intention was to discourage the use of Spirit Ashes, which for the purposes of creating an ultra-hard super boss I can appreciate. Summons are naturally much worse at dodging than humans are, so when combined with her attack frequency, they could just become a free healing source for Malenia. I don't really think this worked out in practice, because if you get lucky, the two of you can just outdamage her lifesteal, but the idea is good, it just needed better execution. That being said, the fact that she still heals on blocked hits is complete nonsense. Again, maybe they did this to discourage being defensive, but as I've hopefully established, the boss doesn't accommodate offensive play either, so I don't really get what shield users are supposed to do. It's very weird that such a specific playstyle is completely invalidated, and it should be common sense that if you don't deal damage, you don't get lifesteal. It's a decision that just goes way over my head. What's stopping her from running up to the wall and smacking it a few times to heal too? The concept is equally ridiculous. These issues could have been fixed and turned into a wonderful fight if Malenia was in any other game besides Elden Ring. It's very hard to imagine them creating her in the same overtuned fashion if she was made for Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3. Lady Maria and Sister Frida are both pretty good foils to see how Malenia's battle could have been executed much better. A Malenia critique wouldn't be complete without talking about Waterfowl Dance, but this move has already been discussed to death, and I don't want to let it distract too heavily from the other issues that the boss is faced with. I'm very firmly in the camp that Waterfowl Dance is a terrible move, but instead of continuing on this tirade for another 10 minutes, I'd just like to quickly address some of the rebuttals to criticisms that I and many others have thrown at it. Namely, the idea that it's too hard to dodge. When one brings that up, there seem to be 3 common arguments made in defense of Waterfowl Dance. Use Bloodhound Step to avoid it easily, use a freezing pot during the startup, or just get good and learn, since dodging it is technically possible at any distance. The problem with the Bloodhound Step argument is that it invalidates build choices. There's dozens upon dozens of Ashes of War in Elden Ring, and I don't think it's fair for a fight to funnel players into using the same single one to overcome it. I know accommodating every build 100% equally is basically impossible with how many there are, but that doesn't mean one option should be so blatantly encouraged over literally every other one. No other fight demands such a specific playstyle, and for good reason. As for the freezing pot, it's a good example of how not to incorporate consumables into a fight. You'll die on Malenia a lot, and if you used a freezing pot for every single waterfowl, you'll probably spend more time grinding for them than actually fighting the boss. Enemies also build up status resistance the more you proc them. It's just not reliable to do this for every time she uses the move. As for the age-old get good response, the margin of error for dodging it normally is simply too small, especially when you have to dodge up close. Not only that, but dodging at that close distance entails doing a really weird circle around her so that she misses you. There's no footage of me doing it because I've never been able to, but either way, it isn't an intuitive method at all, and I don't see how you're supposed to naturally infer such a silly, specific response. The easy way to surmise this is that dodging it normally is too hard, even for a Soulsborne game. It takes way too long to learn how to consistently avoid all the damage, and by that point, I imagine most players are just begging for the boss to be over with, because spending so much energy to learn the response to a single attack just isn't fun. That's all I want to say about Waterfowl Dance. I hate the move, I hate Malenia, I've bashed my head against this fight for so long that I'm sick of even talking about it. She's exhausted me to the point where I just don't care for her. For being the game's capstone challenge, she is such a major letdown, and I will always remember Malenia as the only boss in FromSoft history that's defeated me. Among the bosses in Farum Azula and beyond, Dragonlord Placidusax is easily my favorite. There's a few fights in the series that don't have anything gimmicky about them, yet they still manage to meet and often exceed the presentation and spectacle of the actual gimmick fights. Placidusax is one of those bosses. Somewhat similar to Fortissax, he is pretty hidden away, and you fight him in a separate arena that's only accessible through a secret teleporting spot. There's a very great build and tension as you approach Placidusax's battle. Crumbling Farum Azula's environment has a very stark contrast to the relatively peaceful and transcendent cutscene that brings you to his arena. Everything goes silent, and the dungeon's tornado starts to reverse, as if to bring you to a time before this destruction occurred. It's hard to know what to expect since many other bosses have dialogue to accompany their cutscenes, whereas Placidusax's circumstances are largely kept a mystery. When you awaken in his arena, you spot Placidusax looming in the distance, and suddenly there's this strong sense of anticipation. It's the calm before the storm, and you know that something flashy is about to go down. Invoking that sort of mood in the short time frame it takes from initiating the cutscene to starting the battle is a very strong aspect of the fight. It may not be as detailed or elaborate as, say, Radagon's build-up, but it still sets the player's expectations appropriately, and in my opinion, the fight itself does a better job at satisfying those feelings. Placidusax's destructive behavior makes for a very chaotic atmosphere that suddenly fits with the rest of the tone of Farum Azula. Many of his attacks are lightning or fire AoEs with a much larger scope than similar attacks from Fortissax or the numerous field dragons. The wide coverage of his attacks makes the fight trickier, and it took me a while to work out how exactly to dodge everything. From a mechanical standpoint, one of the best things about Placidusax is that many of his moves require a more creative, outside-the-box response that you don't really use on other bosses. For example, if you're staying behind him, sometimes one of his heads will curve back and spit fire at you. Initially, this feels pretty cheap since they're like the fire attacks from all the field dragons. It covers such a wide area that you have a very short window to start running away if you want to avoid all of the damage. It's made even more challenging with Placidusax, since you don't have access to Torrent's mobility. He's great at running away from other dragons, but that isn't an option here. All you have to do, though, is jump over his tail to the other side and get some free hits in. The tail is like the dividing line between where you can and can't be standing. These games have only been able to rely on moving and rolling when it comes to mobility options, and even though this tail response still isn't very complicated, it is a rather clever application of your limited tools. It uses a problem-solving element of figuring out how Placidusax's fire can conceivably be dodged when it covers so much ground. This is augmented further by turning the camera into a tool instead of a nuisance. Placidusax is yet another massive enemy, but for the most part, lots of what he does can actually fit on screen if you play unlocked. I always like angling the camera so that I can stay behind him to attack while still being able to see his heads and claws. It ensures that his telegraphs aren't coming out off screen so that you can actually know what to expect. The camera in Elden Ring probably hinders players a lot more than it helps, but Placidusax at least makes it a bit more satisfying to use. Making sure that the right things are always in frame is part of the challenge, and it makes you rethink the role of the camera in these games a little bit. It's something that you have full control over, and thus can be incorporated into solving some in-game problems if the developer so chooses. I also think he has some very creative implementation of sound later in the fight, sort of like an expansion on what Astel did. When he starts teleporting around, he often uses a claw attack quickly after reappearing, and frantically spinning the camera around to find him can be a bit of a headache, but there are a couple clever ways to deal with it. The first is to not even bother trying to find him and just rely on the sound cue to signal your dodge. The noise he makes when winding up the claw is very distinct, so that's a perfectly viable approach. People generally have better auditory reaction time than visual reaction time anyway, so it takes a little bit of the pressure off if you decide to focus entirely on using sound. You don't have to spread your focus as thin. I've found it a bit easier to respond to positional sounds instead though. Since Placidusax will almost always appear somewhere behind you, you can listen for the general direction that his claw noise is coming from and hopefully detect his presence that way. You can then adjust the camera accordingly instead of just rotating it everywhere and hoping for the best. I can't think of any other major instances where the game uses positional audio, so this is always a cool trick to execute. His teleportation is a bit of a double-edged sword though. While it allows for that cool sound cue implementation, it also creates another empty time problem. Pretty much every fight I've ever had with Placidusax has been very drawn out towards the end. He likes to teleport around or use his long-range breath attacks during these phases, and it takes forever before you get the opportunity to strike back again. In a way, this could help build tension since it's throwing some endurance tests at you so close to the end, but Placidusax doesn't attack super frequently, so the end result is just a bunch of running around. It's easily my biggest gripe with the fight, and it gets really obnoxious watching him run away when you know you can beat him, he's just not giving you a chance to close it out. It feels like a game of cat and mouse by that point. He also has a really annoying runback, tied for the worst in the game with Rennala's, which is a more minor issue, but I still don't really understand why there isn't a Stake of Marika or even a Site of Grace in or near the arena. Those two things aside, Placidusax is a fantastic boss. I think it's the most creative fight in the game, both with how it's presented and with how his moves are structured. It's very nice to have one endgame boss that manages to hit a fantastic stride, both in gameplay as well as in presentation. Elden Ring's rotten cherry on top is a boss rush, and Malekith is the kickoff to that finale. His first phase, the Beast Clergyman, is probably the most egregious example of unfair punish windows in the entire game, and it ruins a good portion of the fight. I honestly think he's worse about this than Malekith. I think it's pretty clear that you're supposed to keep your distance as much as possible because he has several moves and behaviors that are specifically meant to punish close quarters play. The problem is that these countermeasures are so powerful that I'm not sure what heavy weapon users are supposed to do. When you're up close, many of his claw attacks come out almost instantly to the point where it's nigh unreactable. It's perfectly fine for some fights to be more defensive in nature, but 1, we're at the end of the game now and nearly every fight has been like that, and 2, he can still whip out these moves even after you go in to punish something slow. It's like Malenia with Waterfowl Dance, just with less damage. Even when you engage after dodging a slower move, he can immediately swing his claw around and reset to neutral. You are always risking damage by walking towards him. This is the problem with so many of these defensive fights. After you spend an eternity dodging their extended combos, when it finally looks like you have an opening to engage, you still aren't given a fair shot. It feels like he's straight up cancelling his recovery animations half the time, and I can't tell if he actually is, but he can attack so often that he may as well be, which would be basically unheard of in any of the previous games, even the faster paced ones like Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. Committing to an action has always been a very key principle in these games, but it wasn't just for players. Bosses had the exact same limitation, and that's not true anymore. Beast Clergyman has the luxury of being extremely aggressive and non-committal at the same time. He can go in, finish an entire combo, disengage, and throw a ranged attack at you, all in a third of the time it would take for you to do the same thing. It's hard to identify any of his key weaknesses at all. Unless I'm doing a magic build, I've resolved to just trade hits with him and hope I can sustain enough health to get through phase 2. You only need to put up with him for half of the health bar, so it isn't worth the time spent turtling and sneaking in a single hit every 10 or 15 seconds. When it comes to these endgame bosses, it's hard to know if hit trading is the intention for melee builds. The Beast Clergyman's fast attacks don't deal tons of damage, so it's not like you can't stomach them, but if that's what you're supposed to do, then it isn't communicated very well. Bloodborne had rallying and Sekiro had deflecting, so that hit trading could make sense, and Elden Ring has nothing of the sort. Malekith has a very similar flow to his fight, he's just better at hiding it. Like Fortissax, I really want to like him more than I do. His attacks aren't unfair in the sense that you can avoid them just fine, it's purely the timings between them that's overtuned. Now, there is a way to help circumvent this, but it's kind of disingenuous. It only creates the illusion of a more fairly paced fight because nothing about Malekith himself really changes. Having fought him several times now, I'm pretty certain that you're only meant to do it with the Blasphemous Claw. It's only optional in the same way that Mohg's Physic Tier is optional. Sure, you can fight him without it, but you're making things so much more frustrating for yourself by doing so. There's simply not enough opportunities to attack him without it. This is an item that you can get nearby in Farum Azula. If you progress Bernal's questline far enough, he'll invade you and drop the claw upon defeat. It's an unlimited use tool that allows you to parry Malekith's sword attacks, and doing so will stun him for a good few seconds so that you can counter. At first, this seems like the solution to all of Malekith's problems. It makes sense for an enemy to attack so rapidly if you're supposed to parry them. That's what Sekiro's combat system is about, and it works brilliantly in that game. It's also not consumable, so you can practice with it freely, plus it's super satisfying to hit him with, so what's really the issue? Well, first off, they did a very poor job at communicating how to actually use the Blasphemous Claw properly. All the tooltip states is that it, quote, can deflect the power of the Black Blade, when instead it should say, can deflect the power of the Black Blade sometimes. The Blasphemous Claw only works against a few of Malekith's attacks where his sword has a golden shine. The timing for the parry is actually pretty lenient, but it only works on those 2 or 3 attacks. I have no idea why the item description mentions nothing about this limitation. It's so intentionally obtuse, and I think that's led to a lot of unnecessary confusion. Players will take this item, try deflecting the first attacks Malekith throws at you, then get frustrated because none of that is working, and dismiss the claw as some kind of gimmick, or maybe it's not actually applicable to this fight at all. The entire series has always been vague with its information, so I really don't think you'd be wrong to draw that conclusion. It's also a very strange trick to work out on your own. His blade glowing gold isn't something that sticks out until you already know to look for it. The boss's attacks already have lots of visual effects on them, and that one doesn't seem any different. I honestly never would have noticed it if I hadn't known any better. So the Blasphemous Claw doesn't communicate itself very well, but let's move past that and work with this knowledge to see how it changes Malekith. If you try fighting him without the claw, your opportunities to damage him are extremely limited as a melee player. He flips through the air shooting projectiles and doing epic combo spin attacks like he's a wannabe Devil May Cry protagonist, then when he finally lands, he either immediately runs away to start another combo, or unleashes an explosion at his feet to completely halt your attempts at punishing him. Between the mobility, the explosions, and the giant AoE slash moves, there's too much about him that deters you from approaching. As a result, the least frustrating way to fight him that I've been able to discover is to not even try to aggress. You hold your ground and dodge through his moves over and over, then when he gives you a glowing sword attack you parry it and land some attacks yourself before he recovers from the stun. That's the cycle of fighting Malekith. He doesn't have tons of HP, so repeating that 3 or 4 times should net you the win. Despite the claw seemingly having a profound effect on the fight, this doesn't feel any different from what you've been doing the entire time. You're not actually being more aggressive or engaging with the boss any more than you would normally be, it's just that the periods of time you each have to attack each other have been lengthened. Even though he gets stunned for a long time, he also gets to attack you for a lot longer before you get a chance to parry him. The pacing of the fight isn't accelerated by the claw, it just makes things easier so that you don't have to try weaving in your own offense through his flurry of attacks. I can't deny that this is a very cool idea, and if there was a gimmick fight built entirely around a mechanic like this, I would probably be on board with that, but it doesn't end up making Malekith more interesting. I still hate that you can only attack him during the few moments that the game says you can. I honestly find Malekith a bit of a pushover if you fight him this way, so I guess the saving grace is that at least it's an easy fight. If you've done the fight without the claw and really struggled that way, I encourage you to go back and give it a try if you can. The difference is seriously night and day, and once you work out how to use it properly, it's hard to assume that this wasn't the intended method. Either way, what had the potential to be an amazing fight is ruined the same way many other fights are.
Upon my name as Godfrey.
In many ways, Godfrey addresses the frustrations I just had with Malekith. While both bosses are very relentless with lengthy combos, Godfrey is much more tolerable simply because his recovery windows are just a little bit longer. More downtime is all a lot of these bosses would need to be considerably more fair, and I think Godfrey demonstrates that quite well. At the same time, I have to concede that I'm still not a huge fan of the fight. I'm just a bit conflicted because it's difficult to explain why. Godfrey is considerably less frustrating since you aren't just staring at him flail about waiting for your opening. The two of you are almost always in close proximity to each other, so as soon as you identify an opening you can retaliate, and it's not like Beast Clergyman where he'll suddenly pull out a get off me move that deals unreactable damage. So I wouldn't say that the fight is unfair. Those openings can be a little small if you're using a heavy weapon, but overall it doesn't rob you of your victories as much. I think my conflict comes from the fact that Godfrey doesn't have a consistent rhythm the same way something like Mohg and Loretta do. Mohg was a bit slower, whereas Loretta ran at a pretty smooth medium speed. Both of these bosses fostered something of an internal metronome to make sure that you were always matching their pace. Whether players think about that metronome consciously or subconsciously is up in the air, but either way you could settle into something that felt very natural, and that state was never interrupted unless you died. I would say Godfrey is on the faster end, but his rhythm always fluctuates a tiny bit. Not necessarily because of delayed attacks, but because he doesn't always chain together his moves in the same way, and that creates a lot of hesitation when deciding whether it's safe to punish him or not. Sometimes it doesn't even feel like you can make an informed decision because there's no way to know what the safest option is until it's too late. That's a bit of a messy explanation, so here's an example. He has a basic 2-hit combo that sometimes he'll extend and sometimes he won't, but the time you have to identify which option he went with is too short. Attacking as soon as the 2 hits end is risky, since if he follows up, you're going to get hit, but if you choose to play it safe instead, you may have given up an opportunity to deal damage. By the time you realize that, it's too late to commit, and he's moved into his next action. He has all sorts of these weird decision trees. Sometimes his stomp will be followed up with a close-range blunt, and sometimes it'll be followed up with another stomp. Or sometimes he won't do anything at all. His attack sequences don't have any kind of pattern, and unlike Margit, I haven't been able to figure out what makes him decide to use certain moves after others. That's neither here nor there, though. The more important question is, how much should this be held against him? Is that unpredictability unfair, or is it part of the challenge? I could go either way on that one. A part of me feels like his short downtime between attacks is still a problem, because it doesn't leave you enough time to process his behavior. If you play 100% safe and don't retaliate on those unpredictable moves, then sure, you'll still be avoiding damage, but you won't be able to do anything back. If the best way to counter his unpredictable behavior is to just not engage, then by that point we're regressing back to something like Beast Clergyman. Alternatively, because Godfrey is so relentless, it's pretty clear that he forces engagement a lot more than other bosses do, so maybe it masks these problems fairly well. I feel like I really need to stress that dodging the attacks themselves also isn't unfair. Again, nothing like Beast Clergyman's claw moves, it's just the AI's behavior that's making things difficult. And even if you only engage on his guaranteed safe moves, the fight is probably better than others of its type. Ultimately, I tip more towards the cons outweighing the pros on this one because it feels like Godfrey only stands out for being the best of a bad lot. He doesn't reach any mind-blowing heights, and unfortunately, the game is almost over, so this was really one of their last chances to nail a boss fight, and Godfrey's not quite there. His second phase doesn't do him any favors either. The phase transition is honestly pretty entertaining, so it gets some points for that, but I find Hoarah a lot less enjoyable to fight than Godfrey, and it hurts the enjoyment of the overall boss quite a bit. The main issue with this phase is that Hoarah is the king of delayed attacks. If the game wasn't chock full of these already, then it could have been a more central part of his identity to make it a curveball encounter, but instead you have yet another boss whose entire purpose seems to be built on faking you out. This is terribly frustrating when you're first learning the fight because you basically have to die to learn some of his timings, and that means repeating Godfrey several times until you can get everything down. I'll rehash this point again because it really shows with Hoarah. Most delayed attacks in this game just don't look nor act naturally, and it makes it way harder to get immersed in the battle since you need to remember all of these artificially long timers. And at a certain point it just looks ridiculous too. Like, this boss will slow down time for a second when he's diving towards you just so the attack can be delayed. Or he'll charge up his arm for several seconds before flailing them around because of course, having him swing like a normal person would just make too much sense for Elden Ring. Again, lots of this could have been fine if it was his signature trick, but it isn't. Hoarah is also hindered by showing up at a rather inopportune time. By this point in the game, I was just tired. Tired of all the aggression, tired of all the delayed attacks, and tired of not feeling like I was actually fighting bosses, just watching them. Then Hoarah shows up with all of those traits mixed in, like FromSoft just had to have the last laugh. It's a joke that goes on far too long, and by this point, we had heard it a million times already. No one is laughing anymore, and FromSoft just won't put it to rest. Godfrey and Hoarah strike me as another fight with polarizing difficulty. I've seen many call them one of the easier bosses, largely due to their relatively small health pool, which is definitely true, but other people, including me, have just never been able to click with it. Godfrey's patterns are still pretty unrecognizable, and Hoarah patterns still mess me up. It's another fight that I've started to like less the more I've played. Even with that said, I probably came off as more negative than I really am on the fight, because Godfrey is still good, it's just that he's good when compared to other Elden Ring bosses, which by this point isn't a super high bar to clear.
Thy strength befits a crown.
It's a real shame that Elden Ring ends the way that it does. From a thematic perspective, Radagon is excellent. He's a very fitting final boss for Elden Ring, and all the visual motifs relating to the Shattering creates a nice sense of excitement when the fight begins. There's a great sense of finality, it's just squandered by a horrendous second phase that comes at a really bad time. Let's focus on Radagon first though. I used to think that he was one of the best fights in the game, and while I still really enjoy it, he's not wonderful. There are some similarities with Godfrey here in that many of his attacks start out as melee, and sticking close to him when you dodge is a safe bet, which definitely helps make the fight feel considerably more fair despite his aggressive behavior. Maintaining a close distance between the boss and the player is a decent way to alleviate the game's shorter recovery windows, since very little of your time has to be spent walking back up towards the boss. It's often better to roll into attacks and try to stick behind him so none of the lingering hitboxes will catch you. Then when you're done dodging, you have more time to attack him since you're already in range. Compare this to something like Malekith, who has so much mobility that many of his attacks end far away from you. By the time you close the distance, he'll fly off again, as if he wasn't tested to account for that extra time. If you could dodge close to Malekith, maybe he'd be more reasonable, but you can't. Radagon did well to identify these issues and make the fight very close quarters. It also helps facilitate aggression on the player's part better, since there's potential to catch Radagon when he's in the middle of a combo. If there's a longer delay between some of his moves, you can sneak hits in during that time if you have the confidence, and that can go a long way in making the player feel like they're improving at the fight. Initially, it might feel like his giant AoE attacks force you into unsafe positions, since they cover so much ground and he can occasionally chain them together, but I found that this isn't always the case. It's mostly a matter of just iframing through them. Again, he encourages you to roll towards him, and that works on many of these moves as well. Additionally, while Radagon can have some unpredictable behavior like Godfrey did, generally speaking there's much less hesitation when you're trying to attack him. His recovery time is more pronounced and made clearer thanks to the animation. Again, many problems with bosses just stem from timing issues, and Radagon is more well adjusted on that front. That's not to say that he's entirely free of the over-aggression trend that's been present since the beginning, though. Sometimes he can let out these really long chains where you have to dodge way too much before getting one chance to strike back. In the example I'm showing on screen right now, he attacked 9 times in succession, and I only had time afterwards to hit him once. I don't think these problems are as bad with Radagon since they're less frequent. It strikes me as an unlucky string of AI decisions rather than him being intentionally designed to be that aggressive. That doesn't change anything about how unfair it feels when it does happen, but at least it isn't an omnipresent problem. More of Radagon's problems arise when he starts using specific attacks. There are a couple big ones holding him back from being a top-tier fight. Incidentally, both of them go back to the inconsistent behavior issues that brought down Godfrey. The first one is the quick light blast that he can sometimes do after an initial hammer swing. Usually, Radagon's simple swings lead into a melee combo with either a heavy attack or a large AoE to close it out, and whenever that happens, it's fun to dodge. But sometimes he can swing his hammer once, then immediately shoot out a bolt of light which comes out so quickly that you barely have any time to act after dodging the initial swing. There's about 12 frames between when your roll ends and when the lightning bolt hits you, which is a very short window when you consider the variables that you need to process before deciding your action. If you just assume he's going to use his light bolts after the first swing, you can spam roll and dodge it fine, but if you do that and he decides to melee attack instead, it'll catch your roll and you'll take damage. So I would have liked to see this move have a slightly longer startup to lengthen that window a bit. It's cutting really close to being unreactable. His more frustrating attack is when he starts teleporting around everywhere, which has similar problems. When he reappears, there's no telling what he'll do. Sometimes he'll attack immediately, and other times he'll do something with a slower windup, and it becomes a 50-50 for avoiding the damage. You either roll immediately when he appears and hope he does a fast attack, or wait a little bit and hope he does a slow attack. This one can be more obnoxious because sometimes he'll teleport around multiple times in a row, and combined with the visual effects the move has, it's very hard to get a read on what he's doing. Given how Radagon is more finely tuned in other ways, I suspect that these attacks just slipped through the cracks when it came to balancing, and they didn't have time to be adjusted. Again, it signals a need for further balance patches to help repair a lot of these issues, and the more time goes on, the less hopeful I get that this will happen, but who knows. The only other attack of his that I don't really like is the Golden Grab, since it's such an egregious delay, but that's a less pressing issue. None of that comes close to the worst thing about Radagon, though, the fact that he's tied to the Elden Beast. If this boss didn't exist, Radagon, and the entire game for that matter, would be markedly better. Elden Beast is the worst boss in the game, and to be frank, I don't know if I have anything constructive to say here. It's pretty incredible that this boss manages to be the worst when it's in the same game as stuff like the Valiant Gargoyles and Godskin Duo. It's not even like Malenia where there's some cool ideas. Everything about it is just terrible beyond redemption. I don't even know if it looks nice. The arena is very pretty as always, but the Elden Beast itself just looks off. See, Astel looked like it didn't belong in the world, whereas Elden Beast doesn't look like it belongs in the game. It doesn't capture the same alien feeling, instead it looks almost cartoonish. The character design doesn't feel grounded in the same principles as the others in Elden Ring. That's just the beginning though. Even the worst of the worst fights in the game, or even the whole series, don't have anything on Elden Beast. The entire fight is defined by its tendency to run to the opposite side of the arena and spam magic attacks at you, attacks that you aren't even rewarded for dodging because he's too far away to do anything about it. You genuinely spend 80% of the time running towards him and 20% of the time actually dealing damage, and I really don't think I'm exaggerating those numbers. I'm not even going to go into detailed examples because I think the footage can speak for itself. It's almost comical with how terrible it is. Torrent being disabled for this fight is a decision that is completely beyond me. Not only would it help alleviate these distance problems, it also feels like almost every attack from Elden Beast is supposed to be dodged on Torrent. Elden Beast has some fire-breathing attacks kind of like the field dragons, which always give you access to Torrent. You could jump over the enclosing circle attack on Torrent. You could run away from Elden Stars on Torrent. I'm sorry for making this more of a rant, but I really don't understand it. Even if you had Torrent, I don't think the fight would be very fun, but at least it'd be tolerable. It's such a blatant oversight that's so out of character for FromSoftware. It is also worth mentioning that the Elden Beast is the finale to this endgame boss rush that we've been going through since Farum Azula. To recap, the endgame entails fighting 7 different boss entities without any exploration or dungeon content in between. You go from Beast Clergyman to Malekith to Gideon Ofnir to Godfrey to Hoarah Loux to Radagon to Elden Beast, and that number could be boosted to 8 if you count the Draconic Tree Sentinel guarding Malekith's arena. The prospect of doing that many fights in a row is daunting enough alone, but if these boss fights were more well-engineered, it could have made for an enjoyable challenge. Instead, it's like a boiling pot of problems, designed specifically to test your patience, and to top that off with a fight as slow-paced as Elden Beast, it is a huge slap in the face to players that have spent so much time going through this swamp of combat encounters. I was practically begging for the game to end by the time Elden Beast showed up. Given that the fight lasts so long, it's very possible that you'll die a few times starting out, and that inadvertently hurts Radagon because then he pads the time it takes to power through to the end credits. He also takes up some of your resources so that you go into Elden Beast with less flasks, which increases your chances of dying. Now, I think it's only right to acknowledge that the series hasn't always tried to make their final bosses a challenge. Sekiro is really the only one that I'd say has a difficult final boss. Otherwise, it's been more of an experience, designed for you to absorb the atmosphere and reflect on your journey. And there's nothing wrong with that approach. If the final boss can still hit strong emotional beats, then it can work just as well, if not better. But the end of Elden Ring is so draining that players can be left too tired to fully appreciate what Elden Beast is going for. I'm pretty comfortable saying that it's worse than Dark Souls 2's final boss purely because of how much it disrespects your time. It is an offensively terrible fight, and the only way that I can think to repair it is to remove it entirely. Now that we're at the end, if there's anything you take away from this video, I want it to be what I'm about to say. It's a shame to end on such a negative note, but the game doesn't leave me with much choice. Bosses really fall apart towards the end with how inconsistent they are. You have greats like Loretta and Placidusax to bring the game up, followed by things like Malekith and Elden Beast to tear it all down. If we take a step back to see how all of these fights average out, the cons definitely outweigh the pros. Elden Ring's better bosses aren't good enough to be worth trudging through all of the bad ones. I think that's the main realization I had while making this video. Elden Ring is FromSoft's most ambitious, most commercially successful title to date, and one would hope that incredible combat encounters would be included in that package. Unfortunately, that isn't really the case. Through all of my playthroughs, there isn't a single boss that I get actively excited for, nothing that I specifically look forward to when starting up a new playthrough. When a boss health bar shows up in Elden Ring, it feels like an inconvenience, not a thrill. When looking back on the series in search of jaw-dropping, exhilarating combat encounters, I don't think any of the ones in this game will be easily remembered, and if they are, it won't be for anything good. Instead of remembering how much fun I had while fighting Radagon, I'm going to remember how much Elden Beast inadvertently ruined that experience. There's a lot of very compelling arguments you could make as to why this is the case. Too large of a scope, not enough development time, a lack of new ideas, no one can really say for sure. But at the end of the day, the boss fights demonstrate to me that they failed to deliver the grand convergence of all of the Soulsborne games that many were hoping for. Players have only gotten better at FromSoft games over the years, and by this point it's basically expected that their titles will be difficult. It's clear that they were looking for ways to crank that up this time around, and I really do understand that impulse given the studio's reputation. The problem is that, like every game, the Souls formula has limitations on what's possible, and if these games are to continue on into the future, I think it's about time we address that reality. Before Elden Ring came out, we were 4 Souls games deep, 6 if you want to expand that to Bloodborne and Sekiro, and with the exception of Sekiro, which is a different beast entirely, it's not like any of these games were extremely mechanically deep. You can walk, attack, block, and roll, all of which are done with single inputs. FromSoft has worked with a very limited set of player options to create over 100 different bosses across the series. And before Elden Ring came out, I would say they did a pretty damn good job. Even when they were onto their 4th Souls game, they were still producing some very good ideas. Dark Souls 3 has a very high proportion of quality bosses. But there's only so much you can do with this system before the well runs dry, and all of Elden Ring's ridiculous combos and delayed moves suggest to me that we're close to reaching that point if we haven't already. I really do think that the reason bosses are as overtuned as they are is because FromSoft didn't know what else to do. If they wanted to keep Elden Ring difficult for veterans, this might have been the only option. We've been rolling to the side, or rolling into attacks, or adjusting our positioning for over 10 years now. We've basically seen it all, so what other direction were they supposed to go? Perhaps the more important question is, has every worthwhile Souls boss been created already? To me, the solution is making some more dramatic, permanent changes to the combat system, and I know that won't go down well with everybody, but we've reached a point where Elden Ring is difficult for the wrong reasons. If turning every boss up to 11 was the only way they could move forward, then maybe it's time to re-evaluate the series' priorities. This is why I'm such a big fan of Bloodborne and Sekiro. They weren't afraid to implement some very bold new ideas. Bloodborne streamlines many defensive options and implements systems like rallying to shake things up, while Sekiro strips the combat of many essentials and manages to mold something incredibly unique as a result. Elden Ring's guard counters and jump attacks aren't enough to fundamentally change how bosses are structured. If it wanted to create its own cast of memorable fights, it needed to do more. Sticking with what they knew was obviously the safer option, and given how sky-high expectations were for Elden Ring, I can't really blame them for a lack of innovation. But I think that it signals that the way forward for FromSoft is games that retain the Souls DNA while still breaking away from many established conventions. Basically what Bloodborne and Sekiro tried to do. The optimist in me has faith that they're capable of moving the series in a new direction. Sekiro proves how multifaceted their talents are, and I would be incredibly happy to see them try new bold ideas like that. It's not like Elden Ring undoes all of the lessons they learned either. FromSoft knows how to make good games. But the more pessimistic side tells me that, given how much of a fervor Elden Ring has generated, they want to continue down this road to maintain their reputation, no matter how much the quality of their games will suffer for it. The game already shows signs of that mindset festering, and that worries me. I don't know what the future holds for FromSoftware, but I can only hope that Elden Ring won't turn out as the title that marked the beginning of their fall from grace. Thank you for watching. As always, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Support from the audience is always very appreciated. If you have any thoughts or feedback, please don't hesitate to leave a comment as well. I can't respond to all of them, but I do make sure to read them. Hope to see you next time.